Awesome. So welcome to Metagov seminar and very excited for this session today on attention economies and governance surfaces. So Nathan, Ronen, and Z, please take it away.
Thank you so much, Val. It's a really pleasure to enter into the space the way you set it up. And so we're gonna share a paper that this group of us in Metagov has been working on for a while now, um, and um, and the three of us, uh, me, Nathan, Ronen, and Zargham, will present. But I also just want to acknowledge that our fourth co-author, Kelsie Nabben, is just not here because of time zone issues, but she's very much here in spirit and in her intellectual contributions to the work that we're sharing. So please, imagine her into this space. The problem that we're taking on is in some sense a profoundly real problem, and in some sense a kind of speculative problem. The speculative side of it is what happens if we win, which is to say, what happens if we get governable democratic inputs into our online lives everywhere we go. Doesn't that sound just tremendously overwhelming? Um, what would it what would it mean if the daycare you dropped your kids off at and the neighborhood you live in and the workplace you work in and the social networks that you're interacting with and the online retailer that you're working with are all in some way co-governed by their participants, by you? Isn't that in some sense tremendously overwhelming? And in many respects, this is something that in reality has already come up as a problem for people trying to build self-governing online spaces. Many of the early experiments with DAOs and blockchains and this sort of thing encountered this question of what is the attention economy for governance. And we found that this question hasn't really been taken up and in a serious way and theorized. And it's something that I've experienced both offline with cooperative businesses trying to figure out what is the right way, what should we expect of our members, what should we expect of each other, as well as the kind of online experiments that many of us have been part of. So this paper is an attempt to contribute to this challenge. Ronen, do you want to take it away? Are you
Sure.
there?
Yeah. Too many screens and buttons. Governance overload. Um, yeah. So we started off from this point of attention economies and how it's been theorized kind of in the earlier days. And I'm sure many of you are familiar with Herbert Simon's kind of seminal work on this. In an information-rich world, the wealth of information means a dearth of something else, a scarcity of whatever it is that information consumes, and that's attention. And Herbert Simon is operating in this kind of 1970s bureaucratic firms, imagining people that have to kind of process information somewhat like computers. And if they have a lot of information to process, that is going to consume all their attention and they won't have time to do other things. So it's this kind of simplistic but very powerful framing that is still relevant. But I think we kind of felt we were going up against the limits of this because yes, attention can be scarce in certain settings, especially the settings that Herbert Simon is imagining, but it can also be abundant in many other ways. And the attention economy metaphor just doesn't always work, and it obscures things as well as helps us explain things. So one place where we felt like we were, again, kind of moving beyond the traditional attention economy framing is when we started looking at the commons literature. And I think one of the prompts for me for this paper was reading a lot about Elinor Ostrom and Yochai Benkler, who are like two, central theorists of the commons. And when you read their work, you can see that. So you have on one hand Herbert Simon telling us that attention is a resource and there's economies of attention. But on the other hand, we have these kind of new ideas around how to govern new kinds of economies, basically, right? Like commons, as opposed to the kind of traditional, Elinor Ostrom has a lot of ideas of how commons can be self-governing and how it isn't all just a tragedy. And so she takes us away from some of the scarcity mindset, but at the same time, we were also seeing that they don't really reckon with attention as a limiting factor. So it's kind of trying to bring in some of the new thinking about commons, new economic thinking of commons, but also squaring it with attention. And of course, Elinor Ostrom was mostly operating in online community days. Yochai Benkler was actually quite sharp about seeing a lot of the things that came up with attention. So he did definitely talk about attention in his work, but at the same time, neither of them really looked at the idea of people participating in many spaces of governance, participating basically in many commons at the same time and having to somehow manage that. So that was something that neither of them talked about in this idea of like governance, attention and governance is not something that they focused on because it wasn't really a problem in the spaces they were thinking about. So in practice, what we have is that we have this kind of information overload in the context of governance. We started calling it, I think during the time we were writing the paper, we started calling it governance overload. You're participating in many spaces. You don't really have time to get acquainted with all the proposals that are being submitted, all the context that you need to make effective decisions. And what do we do about this? So this is kind of the context for us coming into this work, where we're looking at these new online communities that are proliferating, and we really don't have the theories or practical kind of design considerations to help us create self-governing online communities in ways that really respect and preserve human attention. Z, do you want to?
Sure, I can talk to this. So one of the ways that we sort of approach this kind of methodologically, you could think of this as kind of like a mapping of kind of information and decision flow. So this diagram identifies the action arena, which is terminology taken more from Ostrom and the commons literature. So this is the kind of environment in which humans are making choices about what to do, what to spend their attention and effort on. And if they have to make a choice between, for example, participation in governance versus maybe taking kind of actual first order activities within that organization, or participating in other environments. And given what Ronen and Nathan just laid out, we're observing that some of that choice is which governance environment to even participate in. But supposing that you choose to participate in a modality or a mechanism of governance of a particular community or a particular commons or landscape, then you have multiple mechanisms through which you might participate. That could be discussions on forums, that could be explicit voting mechanisms, it could be any number of sort of activities that could be thought of as means of affecting the organization's trajectory of governing or steering it. And those activities are aggregated across multiple participants, often with different interests, preferences, and choices of modality, into induced changes within that system, which in turn result in some kind of outcomes. And it's worth noting that those outcomes are both on the system itself, so back around on those same people. It changes the structure, shape, or the lived experience in the action arena, but there are also effects on other stakeholders that aren't necessarily those. So it's not only the fact that we have many different landscapes in which to participate in governance in our kind of modern sort of, both, I think, theorized and very real, like multi-landscape that Nathan described at the beginning, they're also coupled with each other. And so we're making, as individual participants, discrete choices about which action arenas to participate in, how to participate in them, and that ultimately those choices and the activities that are outputs of those choices turn feedback on those same action arenas. And the idea here is that these are not only closed loops, but they're plural in their site, and that many individual participants are forced to choose between which landscapes and which modalities they participate in. And critically, this means that even though we have a generative, and again, this is the balance between these two theories, a generative, hey, lots of people, lots of attention available, it's abundant, we can crowdsource this attention to create and more than we would be able to without this diverse collection of participants. Even at that population level, individuals are forced to choose how much time and effort to put into learning context, how deep to go into a particular governance modality, or even whether they want to participate in governance and their sort of org level steering versus just participate or consume the thing that's being governed. And I think to Nathan's point earlier, that's the case in a lot of people's lives, at least for me. I'm happy to participate in governance of a few things, but most things I have to trust that someone is doing that because I rely on their choices. I can only participate in governance for so many things. I think we can probably go to the next slide. I think this is probably Nathan territory.
Yeah, this points to something Ronen spoke about earlier, which is the question about scarcity and abundance. And one point that we turn to is the legacy of feminist economic thought around platforms, recognizing that often there are forms of labor in platform economies and other economies that are invisibilized, and sometimes attention plays that role. So we need to be attentive to ways in which not to overuse the word, ways in which attention is being asked of people in ways that we're not recognizing that and that we're not supporting. And so recognizing that, for instance, attention can be a form of labor, that governance is a form of labor, and that it not only needs to be noticed, but also provisioned for. Do you want to go to the next one? Okay. So the empirical heart of this project is a series of case studies, and we look in the context of Web3 primarily because this is a space where attention and governance really first became a problem as we've seen it in online contexts. Most online spaces don't really offer a lot of opportunities for participants to do self-governance. I wrote a book about this. It's something that's often not available in our online spaces, but in the context of blockchains and Web3 projects, the idea that participants would be co-governing their infrastructures, raised this problem in a particularly acute way, and where a lot of early projects and ongoing projects in this ecosystem have already been trying to contend with attention. So we look at three different approaches, three different contexts where this has been happening, and these are things that we've mainly kind of participated in or experienced directly. So these are kind of fairly informal but grounded case studies. Ronen, do you want to say a bit about DAO Stack, which is the first?
Sure. So yeah, we have DAO Stack was one of the case studies we looked at. I was a researcher for DAO Stack for about a year in 2021, so I had firsthand experience with some of the events we were looking at, even though some of it also happened before my time there. DAO Stack was behind one of the first DAOs, the Genesis DAO, and they were building kind of the technical infrastructure, the stack, the tech stack for running DAOs. And they're especially interesting in that they had identified the effective management of human attention as a key challenge to be addressing. And they called it the decentralized governance scalability problem. You can't scale up governance if you're not handling this idea of, as DAOs scale, as more people join, there'll be more proposals, and there needs to be some way to prioritize, rank, and filter those proposals. So they had algorithm, or kind of a computational approach called holographic consensus that they developed. And the idea was based around some form of mechanism design, token staking. This was kind of early Web3 days, so there was a lot of techno-optimism and thinking that with the right algorithm and the right smart contracts, we can solve all these what are in fact very complex socio-technical problems. But yeah, there's this idea of staking basically, so that as proposals come in, people stake reputation on whether they think the proposal will be passed or not, and then this leads to some kind of effective signaling of basically allocating attention to proposals that are going to be more contentious or more controversial, and then people can kind of focus their attention on those proposals and ignore the ones that are simpler. So it's a great idea in theory, but in practice, what happened was that, yeah, it didn't really work the way they planned. First and foremost, just because the scale of the Genesis DAO was not big enough to really warrant that kind of heavy machinery of all that game theory, and then there weren't so many proposals even being proposed, so they didn't really need that. And what in fact was missing was basically more tools for deliberation, discussion, like forums, community building operations that weren't even, software related, but just having more time to build community. There were some interviews. There's a great paper we reference in our paper, a kind of retrospective on DAO Stack by Brecke, I think, the name of the researcher, and a few others. And they noted that there was a kind of lack of overarching mission with Genesis DAO. The whole point of that DAO is to use the tools that DAO Stack was creating, so they didn't really have a purpose besides like voting on proposals, and that hindered group cohesion. So, yeah, just to, I guess, summarize that, it's a kind of early case and an example of how the over financialization of attention in the governance of online communities can also backfire. So it's like you're trying to solve it by adding more tokens and more layers of economics, and that isn't necessarily going to play out the way you think, even though they probably have good ideas that we could be using around staking and reputation and thinking about how to rank and sort proposals with computational mechanisms.
Yeah, you want to go to the next one? I think it's interesting, for instance, that I was just at a DAO governance event recently where they were talking about prediction markets in very much a way that, kind of mimicking what DAO Stack was doing years ago, but now in much larger DAOs. So these ideas recur. A second case study is that of Gitcoin, which when it converted to a DAO started out as a delegation system. So building on this idea of liquid democracy, you delegate your stake to a smaller number of people who are going to direct more attention toward governance questions and vote on your behalf. And you could move that delegation whenever you wanted and things like that. But even that they found to be inadequate because people like me, who were brought in as stewards, who people delegated votes to, still didn't have the context to really make decisions. The only vote I participated in was about pineapple pizza, just because I didn't feel like I ever had time to figure out what the heck these proposals were about and what was at stake. So they ended up creating some more social structures. They created a stewards council that would make sure that the top delegates had space and time to really understand the issues at play in the DAO. And so they, in many ways, kind of ended up replicating patterns like a board to create dense interpersonal networks. They also create a reputation system where you could monitor your stewards through cards that would monitor their voting behavior. So they found that they had to develop more infrastructures to manage the attention economies than they initially anticipated. Do you want to go on to the next one? Finally, we look at automation. We looked at an early experiment in automated DAO voting where you delegate your decision making not to a person but to an agent who you've instructed ahead of time, and the agent makes votes in the various DAOs you're in based on inferences on the input you've given it. So it as he suggested, it kind of moves the governance surface from actually making the votes directly to actually having to oversee this voting agent. And it's unclear whether that ends up actually saving you time or resulting in decisions that you like. But there's a lot of interesting work right now going on around agent-based democracy, both in contexts like DAOs, as well as, for instance, in efforts around citizen assemblies and other kinds of more in-person governance, where people are exploring how can we use AI techniques to streamline attention economies, like summarizing discussions so that so that if there are multiple simultaneous discussions going on in an assembly, how can you synthesize those? So this is very much, again, an active area of exploration, but we saw once again a case where the governance surface is being moved through automation. All right. Let's see. Z, do you want to take on the observations and then move us into the heuristics?
Sure, that sounds good. I think I'm gonna harken back to the earlier diagram up to make the observations. It's a recurring theme that do you mind just putting the diagram with the case studies on it real quick? Because I can make my observations to that easier. So one thing that you'll notice about this is that in the Web3 use cases that we are exploring, there is a kind of common base pattern where you have token holders, which are the parties with governance authority. The token is a representation of their right to participate in governance, regardless of whether that's financialized or non-transferable or whatnot. You have a tokenized representation of governance authority and or weight. But that still requires the deliberative processes associated with like agenda setting and figuring out what proposals are going to be on the docket, establishing various rules about what is required to pass a proposal, and then the need for individual actors to then make sense of those proposals in context and to cast votes. And what we've seen in this governance overload context is that that's a lot. And for reasons that people often participate in many of them, especially in the Web3 space, there was this governance overload and this constant need or desire or pain point to find a way to lighten that load. And in each of these drawings, what you see is a mechanism by which that community attempted to kind of change the shape of that governance surface, to introduce a intervention, as it were. In Gitcoin case study, it was a steward role that kind of bottlenecked in a more traditional human kind of scorecards and delegates way. In DAO Stack, it was very algorithmic. It's a set of, basically statistical protocols for determining the need for additional information. I think of that as kind of an information theoretic intervention. And then you have a kind of modern AI sort of, hey, we've got these LLM agents, and that, if you load them up with enough context and give them enough instructions, they can make sense of all of that information for us. And in my opinion, that isn't or hasn't been very effective for the reasons that Nathan alluded to, is that people are not necessarily yet comfortable, qualified, and or willing and able to expend the effort to then govern their agents. But in all of these, and this is the common observation, the intervention, it didn't actually eliminate the attention overload or eliminate a governance surface, it moved it. And so if you jump back to the observations list, I can round us out. We're seeing that the pain point emerged in a common way. We're seeing that there's a desire or a need for maybe aggregate level attention efficiency, in the sense that within a particular community, a certain amount of attention is available that has been volunteered by, made available, and that we need to find ways, at least in my opinion, to help communities and to empower communities to help themselves to recognize, to take stock of their attention, quote, resource, both in its abundance and in its constraints, and kind of make things work locally. So if you go to the next slide, the heuristics for that we've discussed are sort of modes. This basically means being explicit about the modes through which governance is engaged with. And in some sense, this is the making explicit the governance surface, the kinds of things that one can do that affect the steering of the organization, and our ability to be explicit about what they are, and our ability to give people guidance about how to participate in them. Processes relate to the kind of both organizational and technical. You could think of this as the bureaucratic component in some sense, rules, rules, norms, and shared practices that get implemented in order to turn the attention that's provided into outcomes. This could, in the Web3 world, this is often very technical, but in a non-Web3 setting, we see a lot of this is just business process. And again, it converts the effort that your communities, that your stakeholders put into actual outcomes effects. Information is the information that we provide to people in order to become informed. This is actually particularly interesting because the field of information design is itself kind of emerging as a kind of governance surface, how you gather and present information. It was particularly present in the Gitcoin case study, where the development of these dashboards and scorecards, which was information about the delegates, was an important feedback loop for selecting delegates. But there's also information in terms of how we reflect an organization to its larger constituency, so people can decide when, where, and how to engage both as a participant and in governance. Incentives covers the we talked about this as kind of return on intention, like what kinds of costs and benefits. That includes frictions, but also financial benefit perceptions that emerge within these contexts. I would separate this from processes in that processes are like strictly rules in the sense of you follow the rules, whereas incentives are like how you perceive the costs and benefits of what you put in and get out from those modes of participation. And I think possibly most important is feedback. And it's really how this loops back around, because these aren't one-shot games. They're not even really repeated games. They're this like living systems that are made up of people, and the attention is the lifeblood of those systems. And maybe that's me kind of projecting my own kind of personal kind of pseudo-biological interpretation of organizations, but that like without a feedback process that gives rise to a continued injection of attention from the various stakeholders that make up a particular system, it becomes kind of a zombie. And since we're talking about a kind of Web3 based empirical study, you can also look at other Web3 based systems where eventually the attention bled out, and those are the sort of zombie DAOs. And I think that we can move on from there. I want to make sure we get to discussion. Do you want to close this out, Nathan?
Sure. That the main idea here is with these kinds of heuristics, we're trying to pose the question of how we think about attention in governance surfaces, and that we need to recognize attention as a critical aspect of design. And if we're going to build more kinds of governance surfaces in our online lives, we need to be, in some respects, just compassionate about how we design around attention, and honest about what we expect, that we set expectations with our communities about what is appropriate, attention, what kinds of governance inputs they actually involve. And we found that often there are kind of disconnects. So how do we design around attention? We hope that these heuristics we've shared help people start to assess their own approaches to governance design with an eye toward attention, to recognize that unexpected behavior like lack of participation is a form of feedback about attention, and that we've often seen people like blame their communities for what is actually a misdesigned attention economy. And then finally, to make sure that we expect governance design around attention to evolve, recognizing that attention economies change as the size and nature of an organization changes. And finally, I just want to, I just love examples like this, share this photo from one of the annual meetings that happens at the hundreds of rural electric cooperatives that function across the United States, where people in communities co-own and co-govern their electrical grids. And at these meetings, I've been to them here in Colorado, they often have free food and, games and fun. And these are ways of building the attention economy for this governance. Yes, they're going to vote on the board members at that meeting, but they're also enjoying a meal together, a free buffet in this case. And this to me is a small and simple example of how often governance designs have been designing for attention all along. If you go to the next slide, we just have a link to the paper. Thank you all so much for your attention. We'll try to stop overusing that word, and looking forward to what kinds of issues y'all want to bring up.
A quick shout out for Kelsie. Because she's not here, I suddenly feel a moment of need to get some of her points in quickly. So she did her dissertation work at the time, was wrapping it up around when we were writing this paper. She covered self-infrastructuring and this topic of building and implementing these systems kind of by and for communities. And in particular, I found her contributions around the ethnographic component of these feedback loops to the final point there around kind of lived experience, design and redesign, and kind of recalibrating based on lived experience, that feedback loop heuristic is often implemented through kind of human beings who are tracking, monitoring, writing, authoring, and sharing information to make organizations legible to themselves. And I think that's super important. And I wanted to give her an extra shout out since we didn't have her today.
All right. What do you all
Awesome.
want to bring up?
Yeah, thank you all so much for that awesome presentation. Lots of applause. And yeah, if folks have questions, feel free to use the raise your hand feature or type your questions in the chat. We'll move now into Q&A. Go for it, Jonathan.
Hi, this paper is great and really interesting. Did you look at questions about representative democracy as opposed to direct democracy? It's kind of my impression that that's what led to the invention of representative democracy, was things were too big and too complicated for all the citizens of Athens to get together and figure it out.
Yeah, I mean, the closest we come to it looking at in these Web3 contexts is through this delegation mechanism. And I think it's interesting that in some respects, Web3 folks have been trying to get away from the representative logic, seeing, some of the ways in which representation can reproduce oligarchy. I think that is an aspiration in these kinds of communities, yet at the same time, in the Gitcoin case, the delegation mechanism ends up in many ways reproducing a representative function. And so I think it's an example of this kind of meme of the idea that Web3 is speed running economic history, recreating a lot of the institutions that they're trying to get away from, and actually rediscovering the rationales for things like representation as actually an attention economic design.
Alex, feel free.
Hey, what's up, y'all? I was really curious about what efforts were made to kind of look at things through a Daniel Kahneman kind of system one and system two thinking, knowing that your governance body can often be split across a number of different platforms, right? Like, for example, in cryptocurrency, right, you have crypto Twitter, but then you also have Discord, and then you also have Discourse, right? And they operate at different speeds. Especially looking at like your typical forum voting mechanisms and discourse, right? That's like a little bit more slower, a little bit more deliberative. And then the things that you see on like CT or in Discord tend to be like really high paced. And so I was curious, how much did you all look into that? And have you discovered any good mechanisms for kind of bridging these two systems?
I can jump in. I like my first response is that like I think that the Kahneman style, like kind of individual psychological model of system one, system two, the kind of fast and reactive thinking and the more kind of slow, more deliberative thinking has a interpretation at like a kind of collective group level, but it's not as a perfect a match because to your point, there are actually there's an even larger distribution of modalities, temporal modalities, right? So you have very fast paced stuff, but that stuff doesn't actually directly result in enacting something, but it is still salient. And so my intuition is that, it would be prudent, although it is not what we did, to do a temporal decomposition. And I actually did some of that with a work on Gitcoin many years ago around the fraud detection work, where we did some temporal decomposition of the modalities of work required for a community to do fraud detection for itself. For context there, Kelsie and I were both involved in this. Back before Gitcoin was a DAO and shortly after it became a DAO, we were helping develop the sub-DAO responsible for fraud detection. And there was a decomposition of that sub-DAO around the different modalities of work, ranging from like kind of almost near real-time application of the models, to their maintenance, to the development and education of the community that maintains those models. And what you'll see in any one of these settings is that there's like 3, 4, 5 different temporal modes that need to be attended to simultaneously. And I would flag that under a category of like work to be done along the vector that we have highlighted here to understand attention economies and governance across temporal scales.
I would also add maybe one more thought there. I think there's some interesting. I don't think it's in our paper. I wrote some of it in the blog post that I linked in the chat. But this idea of when you have interoperable systems, attention it kind of flows more naturally. So, for example, you're talking about like Discord, all these social networks, right? LinkedIn. If these platforms are closed, it causes especially problematic dynamics with like how attention flows, because you really have to attend to that. I have to look on LinkedIn to see what someone is saying, right? But in more interoperable worlds, for example, I'm pretty active now in the Blue Sky app proto community, if you're all familiar with that. And it's quite interesting to see how my activity in one app can actually be seen by other people in a different app. So it's not, you don't have this kind of fragmentation across apps. And that feels like it's also a really important part of the, better information flows in across apps. Daniel?
Yeah, thank you all so much. This was such fascinating work. I was so happy to see sort of the potluck buffet slide at the end. I think that like really brings it back to like the human side of the thing, not just like the technological solution. And mine's sort of related. So I work in free software and work with a lot of free software communities. And one problem we have is that people sort of don't take the opportunity to participate. So I was wondering if you have any like thoughts about sort of building the attention economy muscles for communities, specifically in digital spaces, so that we're like shaping that governable surface to the particular community. How do we make it more inviting? How do we practice that? If you have any thoughts.
I think I would just go back to recognition that probably the answers are in our past, that that it's kind of an old-fashioned thing. I think we imagine that with kind of folk histories of things like Wikipedia and open source software, that oh, somebody just threw something on the internet and then everybody just gathered and it magically happened, as opposed to people built organizations and seeded participation. And that's why I think the spaces like Metagov, and for instance, Val was talking about playtesting events earlier as something that we're actively organizing. And I think those matter, that kind of effort, like Val leads in building community in this space, really matters, because participation doesn't happen magically. It has to be again, to use a word that comes to me from feminist economics, provisioned for. You have to invest in creating spaces, just like a corporation pays its board members and flies them out to fancy places and feeds them fancy dinners, and this is all part of investing in the practice of governance. We need to not kind of dispense with the magical thinking that people are just going to show up and participate, and instead recognize, okay, what do we need to do in order to invite people to participate? What do we need to do to make sure that it's worth their while to participate, that they understand that there's a value in it for them, whether it's through community or financial remuneration or something else. There are a lot of different ways to align to get those incentives right, but I think it's a form of basic respect, to be able to recognize that people are not going to pitch into your thing just on their own. That one way or another, you're going to have to create something worthwhile for them.
Yeah, I want to riff on the comments in the chat too about this regarding extrinsic versus intrinsic motivation. It's a reasonably well-known phenomena in behavioral economics that extrinsic mechanisms like financial penalties and fees have a tendency to overwrite rather than be additive with kind of more social and kind of intrinsic motivation style things. And for the setting aside the Web3 stuff for a moment, like in my own experience helping organize communities, again, food, parties, swag, they play really important roles in the incentivization structure, especially in places where from a kind of business level economic standpoint, it's actually impossible to make the dollars and cents add up. That a lot of the normative and social value created in community and through governance and enabling participatory governance actually is not something that you can make add up if you try to do like a kind of hours-based financial remuneration or assess on a kind of basic capitalist economic return on investment model, but it can still be a very real return on attention when you think about the other kinds of benefits. And that is, in my experience, created by, and again, to make it really concrete, like I was the board president of a nonprofit where like we had an annual meeting, we needed to get people to governance, and our annual meeting was coupled with our big summer like barbecue party. Literally, that was how you created the incentive to participate in governance. And we would have a break to have the, let's say the new people running for board or like a general address, but it was like a 45-minute carve out of what was otherwise like 5 hours of hanging out in the city parks, grilling and socializing. And like that was a major budget line item for the organization. And that wasn't there because we wanted to have a party. I mean, we wanted to have a party, but like it was a necessary component of the incentives required to meet quorum for our governance to take place. Like without that party, we would not meet quorum.
Yeah,
I have a quick question on that, on what you just said, Zargham. So does you said that that extrinsic motivations overwrite, and maybe you said that they aren't additive. What did you mean when you said that they overwrite?
So like imagine that you have a setting where actually the original, let me just start with the literal canonical reference was about people picking up their kids from a daycare late. And the social disincentive to pick up your kids late is very much present when they introduced like a system of finite fee, people perceived that as then having paid for the right to be late, and it actually increased rather than decreased the amount of lateness. And that in fact mechanism design, like for example keeping track of, this is the information heuristic, who was late, and broadcasting it amplified the normative incentive to not pick up your kids late rather than the financial fee, which gave people a sense that they had paid for the right to be late. And so that's a minor difference in mechanism design, completely flips the effect on the behavior.
I saw Florian had a question in chat. I wanted to see if you wanted to give voice to it, and then Malcolm next in stack.
Yeah, I think I'm not sure if I'm understood enough because I'm really new to the whole topic to ask that question. But earlier, when there was mentioning liquid democracy, and that it's all part of like whenever there's too few participate or too little participation, we just need to focus more on the attention economy. And I was thinking like it sounded like maybe I misunderstood, but it sounded like platforms like Temu or I don't know, which really work with the psychological traits and weaknesses of people would really benefit from this thought or from this approach to it. So I was wondering if you could clear my misunderstanding up.
I'm not sure I totally understand what the question was.
Earlier there was like you were mentioning that there has to be food or has to be a party or there has to be several kind of things which make people start participate in elections or in whatever there is to participate in. And there was one comment on like if there's too few people to participate in an election or in a liquid democratic election, like wouldn't that be an incentive for the people who organize this election to use all kinds of psychological traits on people to make them participate in things like that?
I think that in practice, like governing organizations is really like muddling through like in my experience, like most people, governance isn't something that they're really thinking about. It's a kind of necessity. And in the case of the example I gave about food and a party, like part of that was just in the bylaws. We had quorum rules. We have to meet the quorum rules. We literally can't ratify a budget, elect new board members. Like we can't do what we do, but people care about the doing what we do, they're not actually caring about governance as such. There's a particular special character of like a space like Metagov that's full of people who are really thinking hard about governance. But in the organizations that I've been involved in, like most of the time, governance is it's like not explicit. It's like it happens because it needs to happen because there are bylaws and rules about how the organization is comported, but like there isn't necessarily like a ongoing meta-analysis about like the state of governance, if that makes sense.
But I think that's really interesting case where that organization decided we're going to put in a poison pill to force through this quorum, force this participation and say this kind of participation matters. And I think what this paper asks is where are you putting those designs in? Maybe the concern was, okay, the board is really managing most governance, but we want to have at least one input a year where a large number of people step in. And I think that's a really important conscious decision. And I think in any organization we should ask, what are the things that are appropriate to do at a smaller scale with a smaller number of people with focused attention? And then what are the things where more dispersed attention is important? And is it too much to ask for that quorum? Or is that a necessary kind of pain point that we want to have to make sure that everybody in the organization feels that they are being called upon in some way? And every organization has to ask that differently. I don't participate actively in the governance of my credit union, even though I'm a member. Most people don't. But there are other communities where, like social.coop, this social media cooperative I'm part of, I do like to participate more actively because, it's rewarding in those intrinsic ways. And these are questions we should be asking ourselves really intentionally, rather than what we hear a lot, I think, is a sense of, oh, why aren't people showing up to this annual meeting? Why aren't people voting in every single DAO decision that we have? Like, don't you care about our DAO? When the level of expectations compared to the voice that people really have is just out of alignment.
And I'll invite people, I mean, this is a personal reflection, but I invite everyone to like pick 2 or 3 things in their life to like really commit to being part of self-governance of, but then like to like let yourself off the hook for everything else. Because I think if everybody picks a few things and really like does take part and chooses to give attention to governance, that then it really is very generative, but it's just honest about like, the fact that doing a good job in that is a lot of work. And I mean,
but it also requires aligning incentives to ensure that, I did go to one of my credit union meetings. I have met with a board member, and I became satisfied through those interactions that this organization is set up to represent me, even though I'm not actively involved. And that's something we also have to design for. And I think incentive alignment is an important tool, not the only tool. Mission alignment is also really important, but we have to be willing to trust those institutional designs.
The information design heuristic in our list is also potentially a key element of that. So like the incentives for you to feel confident that you're well represented and the lower cost of attention for you to come to that conclusion is part of designing the legibility, the information design part. So just to kind of note, yeah, I totally agree. And I think that that's part of what the information heuristic represents in the paper.
Cool.
Okay, thank
So
you.
Yeah, so we only have 2 minutes left. We can squeeze one more question in, and Malcolm was next on the stack. So Rosa, if you don't mind, your question will be the first in our Slack follow-up discussion. So y'all should join the Slack and we can continue there. But in chat, Malcolm asked, if we understand attention as both a response to Maslowian needs and a reaction to stress, then what ways could DAOs transform the attention economy, not just as a function of technology, but as a solution to the human needs themselves? Final thoughts on that from our speakers.
That's a really big question to do in 1 minute.
Yeah, I have a thought on it. I mean, my participation in DAOs, like at the peak of the DAO kind of boom, was like really entertaining because all of a sudden I was able to join a team and kind of there was like this task board, and I just had this incentive to earn tokens by like doing tasks on this board. And it was this distributed way of participating in governance, like bite-sized chunks of tasks that this organization made opened to a wide group of people. And I had never seen anything like that before. And I don't know, it was very formative in the way I think about, that DAO has since sunsetted. So like many, I think there was like this over financialization problem at the core of it, but honestly, it was very transformational in my understanding of what's possible when it comes to organizing people, getting people to participate in things, whether it be big governance decisions or just like, retweet something and earn a token. It's like something simple like that was doable. And all organizations have things like that, ways of making participation more accessible, governance more accessible. But yeah, I had never seen that done in any way like that. So it was really cool, and I think points to some potential avenues for growth, even though that DAO has sunsetted. So yeah, thank you all for joining. Again, we can continue discussion. This has been amazing. So please join us in the Metagov seminar channel. I can start up a thread for us to continue discussions. And I'll bring our chat over there as well. So if you miss something in the chat, we can bounce off from there. But please, everyone, if you take a second to just unmute, give our speakers a round of applause. Thank you all for joining, and hopefully see you at another seminar soon. Have a great day, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.